so yeah, I've entitled my talk for When the Bell Tolls. So I'm going to be showing aspects of the patch and some of the stuff that I've been doing leading up to the performance tomorrow. So at the start of last year, it feels really weird with this podium, but at the start of last year, whenever we started, I did a lot of different experiments, many of which got abandoned along the way. And the stuff that remains in it are sort of two main strands, descriptory stuff and HPSSE stuff. So I'll kind of go into some detail about some of those and show some examples of things I've done with that. So yeah, you can read that. So descriptory stuff. I further developed and kind of honed in on this sort of onset descriptor thing that I've been working on for a bit predating this project to try to get onset detection and descriptor analysis working together in some kind of meaningful way so I can detect an onset and then have some meaningful information about what was contained in that onset. The trade-offs here, of course, latency, because if I'm doing this in a real-time context, I don't want to wait around very long. So that obviously makes things very tricky. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of that and how the stuff developed along that. So the onset descriptors things in general handles mainly all of the audio and sample playback throughout the performance in the patch. There's one large corpora, which I'll explain shortly in another section of it, and then a smaller corpora that does get HPSS'd as well. So this is, the onset descriptor thing is the core nugget that drives a lot of the patch. For this and for the purposes of what I'm doing now, the only really descriptors I meaningfully used are loudness and spectral shape, specifically centroid and spectral flatness. So there's a sort of orange to orange shaped apple thing there, or apple to orange shaped apples thing there, where what I'm analyzing from the onset is not what I've pre-analyzed the database. So for the corpora analysis, I have all the time in the world, and I can analyze all sorts of things that I want with loads of descriptors and loads of statistics about descriptors. But given the fact that I want very little latency when I'm actually doing it in context, it means that the information sets I'll have will intrinsically not be the same. I'm not too bothered about that because in this sense, I'm playing drums and I'm triggering samples of, arbitrary types. So the actual overlap of these sources is not significant anyway. So as long as I'm, with my input set of descriptors, able to somewhat navigate the sort of descriptor set that's there, that's kind of good enough for me. This will hopefully get expanded once you get into the second toolbox stuff of sort of dimensional reduction and other sort of techniques for that. But at the moment, it's just doing loudness and spectral shape. 512 samples is about as far as I was willing to go. I'd like to narrow that down. But that also gets kind of a little tricky because that gives you X amount of frames and you have to ignore the beginning and end. A big change in this was blocking mode, or rod mode as it was described to me when I was first told about it, in that the latency that I was getting was very poor. So when I was first building this, I was building a version in Alex's tools in parallel with this. And with Alex's tools, I was getting a latency of the actual processing time, not of like the waiting time, of 0.5 millisecond, which was doable with. Whereas with earlier versions of the FluCoMa one, this was upwards of 200, 300, 400 milliseconds, depending on what else was going on, which was not cool. So with blocking 2, that comes down quite reasonably. And I'm going to develop that a bit further, but I'll kind of just show you a little bit of this. So just hit play here. No, that would be great though, huh? I was very impressed with you. Yeah. Oh God. Wait. There we go. So this is, this will take a second to load. It's the main set of samples I'm using is about a little bit over a gig. It's 300 samples of various metal attacks. So I've just loaded them into polybuffers and associated audio descriptors, which I won't really talk about now, but there's a lot of them. And then what I have here is just some of the sounds that will be coming out of my snare. In the ballpark of it, yeah? So audio like that is going in. So it kind of does something along those lines. And among other things, the main stuff happens here. where there's a process that's just telling me what frame I'm going to start analyzing from in a rolling buffer, and then loudness and stats, spectral shape and stats. I do apologize.
You should be ashamed, it's on YouTube.
I know, yeah. And yeah, the main thing was blocking 2 actually tightens that up. Then you do have to get kind of explicit with the size of the buffers, which was a little faffy to figure out, but once you sort of bake this in, then it's fine to go. So that's the main meat of that part of the patch. So that was the main thing of that. I do want to expand this in future things where I'll go down to kind of a smaller sample thing or a higher sample rate, maybe. Build in more statistics, and I did have some kind of chat with Pei about other ways to do this. So like obviously have like a tiny fragment of audio that I can analyze, but maybe also have medium and longer form windows that are also analyzed that I can weigh them together. But some of that I think gets a little pushing at the edges of what I can in terms of my actual querying and sort of fusing these descriptors together. So I wasn't sure of how to best implement it, because one thing that's critical here, which is I wasn't really sure about how to best query the database, is for my purposes, I always want something to return. If I get Onset, I always want the nearest sample to play back, even if it's very shitty. So that kind of means the way that I query them has to be a little weird, because with Alex's object, the sort of queries happen serially, and if any of them terminate with no solutions, then it kind of stops. So I sort of pushed at the limits of what I can do there. And then to build that thing, I did some sort of batch processing, which isn't terribly exciting, but I didn't want to have to deal with doing stuff. So I just opened it, analyzes a whole ton of stuff, and then saves it to a database. One thing that I found, which is obviously wasn't obvious to me at the time, but I was doing analysis. So all of those metal samples, there's ones that have bounces in them. So I wanted to, as part of the information that I'm analyzing, have information about how many attacks were in any given one. So that's the stuff I'm analyzing for. And onsets is one of them. So how many attacks so basically to know whether the sound I'm going to play back is a single attack or has bounces. So I used compared a bunch of the different buff onset slicers, and I found one that worked well and some settings that worked well, but it wasn't perfectly accurate. It wasn't always accurate. So for example, some of the metal sounds have a lot of vibrato in it or amplitude modulation, and this would trigger additional onsets. So after a while of that, I ended up doing a thing where I parse for names. So I just kind of check all the files that have drops in it will have at least 2 onsets. So I kind of just did some just string parsing to kind of get more meaningful information out of that. And other than that, this is just a max for loop. And then all the rest is over here. The other sort of semi-clever bits, or I don't know if it's clever or not, but with some help from Owen. So I have long samples up to like, so let's say 30 seconds, and I want to know the pitch that's in this sample. So it's a monophonic, like sort of metal sound. Mean and median weren't working. The confidence didn't really work just because it's such a long thing. There's so many frames. I don't really know what's accurate. So in the end, it ended up being taking sort of the highest 80th percentile across the whole sample and then taking a median of that, some sort of aggregate thing of this. And I think it's more accurate, but I don't think it's 100% accurate, but like for the purposes of what I was doing, it was accurate enough. So I basically have an optimized pitch entry in here. So I have like the median, the confidence, and then this optimized, which is that algorithm there that kind of narrows that down. So that's my batch processing thing. It takes about 30 minutes to run through my whole set of metal sounds.
How big is the set?
Gigabytes, like 3,000 samples. They're long because they're higher sample rate in stereo. So, but for the purposes of this, I made everything 44.1 and mono. I think it was like 13 gigs is the original library. Another thing is, again, because they're very long samples, is analyzing the first 100 milliseconds separately as well. And in terms of my matching, this is what I actually match against, because the mean of a sample that's like 30 seconds long with like a sharp attack is not very useful. So that's that stuff. So yeah, the pitch, this was a tricky thing. I do another thing where I wanted to get pitches out of comb audio. So I have audio that sounds something like this. and you're like, those are great notes, I want those notes. And I do too, because I don't like to make decisions about pitch. So I used amp slice, which I find to be confusing and for other reasons, but for this, the purpose of this, I figured I'd use it. So I basically use amp slice and fluid pitch, and then when the confidence is above a meager 0.6, I say save that. And then there's some other little bits in here, but nothing too meaningful. And then what I do in the patch is I use this to feed a pool of notes that will be the available bass notes later on. So I just transpose modulo and do some stuff there, but that sounds like this. This isn't what it will sound like in the context, but this is just to sort of demonstrate. Is it too loud? And so on. I have the threshold set so it isn't too trigger fingery, because I don't want, so like it's only the louder ones and only when the confidence is above a certain amount. In the patch itself, I end up just making a database of the notes that are stored for later reuse. Okay, so that's, I think, the last bit of the descriptors thing. Yeah. And then other than that, I got into some HPSS stuff. So mainly doing like three-way splitting, and then incorporating into this like a sort of a larger subsection of the patch. So with the three-way splitting, I wanted to get something that could give me sinusoidy type material, not sinusoidy type material, and transienty type material. So what I found worked the best for that in the testing I did was harmonic, percussive, and then transients. And the order of operation gives you slightly different results. I've made some suggestions on the forum to kind of have a way to navigate that in a kind of musicianly way. But basically I broke it into the harmonic and percussive, and then broke the percussive into transients and not. And then there's some sort of thing about like what musically is a transient, because for my taste, what all of the transient objects return now, I guess is what a transient is, but like musically to me doesn't make too much sense. Like I can't do much to that transient to process it to make it very different. So like running it through wave shapers, or I guess reverb and stuff like that works, but it feels like you're dealing with things like compression and stuff. Like it's more like dynamic management, as opposed to, I like to have like what I consider to be sonically a transient and be able to process it differently, but that's neither here or there. So yeah, I did the three-way splitting. I did a lot of experiments early on with NMF, but I ended up going with more HPSS-y things because it gives me more somewhat usable results across a range of material, whereas NMF tends to give me essentially arbitrary results from it, which is fine, but like for what I'm doing, I preferred the other thing. So the next one here, this is closer to what the comb thing will do in context. So I'm loading a small set of samples here. I have a set of the gong pitches that are in here. So this is just pre-analyzed ones. This part of the patch doesn't really matter so much. But what's in here is I took a bunch of gamelan samples and I pre-analyzed them and broke them into a harmonic, percussive, and transient components and put them back together as a single 3-channel audio file and saved them to a disk. And then I use the Onset descriptors as I was showing before. So whenever I give it, in this case, this is audio from a bass drum trigger, so like literally on a bass drum. Whenever it hears that audio, it takes the loudness only, finds the nearest one from the database, compensates for the difference in volume. So like if I need negative 16 dB and the closest one is 15, I compensate the volume. And then I also zero out the pitch. So I normalize the pitch to a neutral, whatever note in it. And then I choose one of the pitches from the comb thing from earlier. So the comb thing makes a pool of notes. So now every time this bass drum trigger hits, it will trigger one of these. So you get something that sounds. Or at some point I do like a. So the gongs, the transient is going through one set of DSP, which is this part here. It's going through a filter and a wave, slight wave shaping in here. And then each of the other two, the harmonic component goes through an envelope like that, and a little bit of overdrive, and then the percussive component goes through another envelope like that, and goes through a wave folder. So each one is kind of processed differently, and then there's, depending on the amplitude or some other audio descriptors of that particular onset, it modulates some of the parameters for each one. So the duration of it, the treble within the wave folder itself, and some other aspects of that patch. And then this one.
Yes. Before you, how do you split the transients, since you say that what the transients are, you're not happy with it? How do you isolate transients?
Using fluid.
Yeah. You use the transient.
Yeah. I mean, I'll show in this next one. Like I'll show because they're just.
Yeah.
Which is cool, but like that, if I run that through something. So for me, a transient. So I guess whether you're going with like a technical description of what transient or is a musical description of what a transient is.
For me, I think it's musical. But
so like if someone was playing a snare and you're like, oh, the transient's on that real sharp. like for you, like it would literally be just
the first millisecond.
This is, I think, smaller than that.
I mean, you can't tell how long it's going to be coming out of that object, but I suppose the important thing for me, well, the two important things there, we had a conversation about what different people, members of the team, consider transients to be, and we weren't all in agreement.
Are we on the same page?
I'm somewhere in between,
okay.
I think, but any of these splitting techniques is a mathematical model, so we can't really consider them to be. I don't consider that any of them are correct. I'm not even sure there is such a thing as a correct model of it. So, one thing is modelling.
I'm not even sure there's a musicianly agreed model.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, so one is modelling lines that go one way or another in a spectrogram, and the other one is modelling deviation to an autoregressive model. And so and then it's so and also as you parameterize them differently, they'll give different results. So I don't think that those things are kind of strict. I don't think you can consider either of them to be absolute. It's just that they're modelling slightly different things. Yeah, I mean for me, for me it falls a little flat. Like if I have like a drum beat or some sort of percussive thing, if I remove all of the transients, I maybe wouldn't have noticed had I not been paying attention. Like it's quite subtle. The other interesting thing is this Eventide Physian plugin that people may or may not have seen. They describe it as a transient tonal separation. I think it's something similar.
Presets for that for either type.
Well, there we go. I consider it to be probably like an HPSS type thing. That's the most likely, and that is splitting audio. So you send that off to different processes, and so obviously they want the audio going in both directions to be something kind of more musically meaningful.
Yeah. So for me, and I'll show in this other one. I have it there as an option, but what it reduces down to, I find doesn't respond to much. Which would maybe.
Again, it's interesting because you go to plugins, the musician plugins and the mastering plugins have got a very different definition. The mastering engineer are very much more precise what they consider transient manager, and musicians probably more hear the difference.
Yeah.
So it is. Let's put it like this: it is, as Alex said, it's a model that is loose and culturally anchored, or very, very culturally dependent.
Yeah.
So at the moment, I was just excited because I remember you and I talked about using these transit that are to trigger envelope, a basic crossfade between, and taking a bit more than that out.
So I did that. I did early comparisons with that, but that one didn't feel right either.
Okay. Good.
Yeah. So a pure temporal slice, I don't know is accurate.
I think one thing to note here as well is that when you use HPSS, it actually depends on both lines, horizontal and vertical, present in the spectrum. So it's not as independent. If you use transients, that's a completely independent model of the transient. The HPSS actually depends on the other content that is not transient to find what is percussive.
Right.
So it uses both harmonic and percussive.
Yeah, I mean, in my batch processing, which I'll skip by because it's not terribly interesting, but I slice the transients first, and then what's remaining I do harmonic and percussive. Whereas what I do for the other aspect of the patch, I do the opposite. I do harmonic percussive first and then transient, because I just had forgotten what I did at each point. But this is something that I think having a matrix where you can audition each of the things would be useful. But for me, I was mainly thinking that I have the transient on its own. Let me run it through an EQ or put some stuff on it. And I was just I don't really hear anything. So to kind of maybe show that, so I took an older bit of processing that I've been doing, this sort of like real-time granulization stuff where I'm writing stuff to a buffer and reading from that buffer based on onsets. So I'll just kind of show a little bit of what that sounds like, just leading off the end of this discussion. So I'm feeding it audio that sounds like this. Okay. So this is purely the wet. So behind the scenes, what I have is I've done kind of what I described before, where I broke. There's a whole set of processes involved in what gets written as a grain. So whenever there's an onset, it analyzes for a whole bunch of audio descriptors and statistics, and depending on that, writes a grain of a certain size and analyzes it for this sort of processing, breaking to harmonic, percussive, and transient. Then I write that into a 3-channel buffer. And then there's a separate playhead that is reading from that 3-channel buffer. This timbre parameter is how I hide HPSS from the user. So rather than having to think this technically, it's sort of like a musician-y way of doing it. So with the timbre at 50-50 or 50%, we hear every component. So that sounds like this. So if I go down to 0, this is only the harmonic, which I actually boost in volume a little bit because it ends up being a little quieter. And I kind of have fades in between. So this being everything and this being just a harmonic. Okay. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I kind of start fading out the percussive, and this is only transients, which is kind of cool, but like it isn't a lot. So I only really like have that fade happen kind of up here. But between all of this, you kind of get, and in context, if I have the blend back at a normal thing, it's almost like a wet dry for a reverb. So if I bring this to like more harmonic, I hear my actual playing, and I just hear the sort of granular, like as a wet only reverb, or you know, the opposite of that. Or if I want it to be more pronounced, or if I only want the sort of popcorn sound. Kind of, and there's a, it is, but like it's just weighted.
Okay.
So like as you turn the.
It's just 3 multiplies. 3 channels.
Yes, but like with scaling for each one.
Yeah.
But yeah.
You're just getting some, when the dial is in one position.
All of them are 100.
Just fixed.
Yeah. It'd be cool to maybe do something more sophisticated than that, but
You posted that on the forum.
Yeah.
So people can download it.
Yeah. I mean, it's changed a little bit since then, but the general thing is there. So, and then I just massage the values a little because at 12 o'clock, everything's full volume, and it's the sound as it was recorded, so it would null sum. And as you go this way, I boost the harmonic volume just because it ends up being too quiet. So you get fake things as you go that way, and then the same thing when you go the other way. The way that the things move are just adjusted in a more musically useful thing. So in that one, pardon the messy code.
Oh God. Wait for mine. I'll set the standard.
Yeah, there's a whole series of things here that happens that it's constantly recording grains. When there's an onset, it crops the last bit, implies a little bit of fade. Then depending on the, where is it? I take the derivative on the mean of the derivative of loudness. I scale that to something that's useful for the range of numbers I'm working with. And parallel that, I take the time centroid from IR stats, which I've found to be very useful, and apply a very complex averaging algorithm here. And then clip it because, as I discovered, which was another bullet point on there, little grains don't like to be messed around with. So grains smaller than a certain size don't just return nothing with the harmonic percussive split because there isn't enough harmonic bins or however it works. But yeah, so like I kind of, in the end, I mean, that's a small enough grain. I don't really need to go much smaller than that. I was pushing it like, I didn't have this clipped to 4, and sometimes it leaned into the 20s, but it's fine enough that it just clips there. And then I just massage the HPSS parameters so that always returns something. And then I think that's the last bit of it. So yeah, breaking into the 3 grains here. One thing that I found very useful with that is having it wrapped up in a metaphor instead of having, having it wrapped in a metaphor in terms of presenting this information. So this is kind of an effect that I had before. I just repackaged up, redid it a bit better, and then built the FluCoMa stuff into it. But I didn't want to have an option for how much harmonic component I wanted. Like as a user, you don't need to care about what the material of your capacitors is. And then there's some batch processing associated with that, but that doesn't. It's not terribly important. It's kind of like what I showed before. So yeah, I guess if there's any other questions.
We have 5 minutes for more questions. We jumped in, so you should feel free to jump in questions, I think, except if some presenters are allergic to the concept. But Owen.
So when you put all this together in performance, what happens? You turning bits on and off?
All right. So there's a whole lot of controllers, and then there's a whole bunch of other things going on. There's like these little solenoid robot things. But I have a series of the modules plugged in. Some of the stuff is just hidden behind the not really visible. But like the comb audio pitch detection happens when I enable a certain mode in it. It's tracking pitches, and then that feeds the thing. So whenever I play the bass drum, it does these triggers. I can turn on and off that sample playback for the whole thing. There's a whole layer. The bulk of my thinking for the performance and the musical materials involved has very little to do with this stuff. It's a lot of like the stuff around sort of this kind of controller, sort of DJ techniques on a snare, and like little robotic stuff. So the like musical stuff isn't as related to this stuff, but this is some of the guts of it. But essentially, like I have these 2 controllers. This turns on and off some of the different things, and the other one does a few things throughout the stuff. But I can turn the onset detection stuff on and off. I have a one shot of it. These enable 2 different modes of the solenoids, and these also turn on the pitch tracking from the comb. The cloud thing I can turn on whenever. And then there's a couple different playback modes which have nothing to do with what I'm showing here.
These like strapped to a drum or something.
Yeah. So there's, I don't know if I'll find the photo quick enough, but like so like my drum has all sorts of stuff on it.
It's risky.
I know, yeah. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of things like this, like these little robot solenoid things with, well, there, that's close enough for now before I go scrolling through weird photos. But there's this controller strapped to the side and this strapped to the side with a whole bunch of 3D printed stuff. Oh, yeah, and then these little solenoid things which will be spread around all over the like stage and audience.
They'll see them tomorrow morning while you build them in the room.
Yeah.
So you can.
Well, you won't because they're all black and they're hidden.
No, but they'll see them
Yeah.
in the morning here.
And I think there's a few of you at least, because I have 6 pieces of aluminum foil that need to get applied halfway through the performance, so there'll be some discrete helpers involved in that.
You need to drive them.
Yeah.
Any other question?
Why are we having issues getting it to match everything? Or always return a match?
So if I put reasonably picky descriptors, so like plus minus 6 dB or less for loudness, and then for each of the related statistics, if it didn't find a match for loudness, the query terminated.
Yeah, you can switch to the scaling modes.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure how much of that stuff
And then you'll get exactly the same numbers, but you'll always return them.
Okay, that's good to know. Because like in some of the stuff I was finding with PA, like if I'm...
But your search will take longer.
Yeah.
That is bad for him. Don't know.
Yeah.
So
it depends how many descriptors.
I mean, there's a lot of descriptors, but there's only 3,000 entries, which is much less than other patches I've done this with. But it was mainly that I wasn't sure how to best.
It doesn't matter how many entries there are, how many search queries there are.
And then I also wanted to because it'd be very useful to have sort of weightings, or like these 2 descriptors I want to kind of I consider to be one kind. So that side of it got a little above, and what I had was working. So I was like, okay, this is fine.